Bonjour. Très heureux d'être là pour animer cette
Good
table
morning.
ronde.
I'm very pleased to be with you to moderate this roundtable for this fascinating topic that you have already talked about a little bit earlier. Thank you very much, Guy, for inviting me. We are going to talk about how to fight antibiotic resistance. Antibiotic resistance was already announced by the discoverer of penicillin, Fleming, when he received the Nobel Prize. In his speech, he said, well, we've got antibiotics. The risk is going to be resistance against these antibiotics. And he was right, and we are there now. And we feel that we fear that now it's going to become a bigger and bigger problem in terms of public health. Countries are becoming more and more aware of it. Some economists who know this topic very well planned, predicted that this could lead to 50 million deaths by 2050 and could have an impact of 4% on the GDP by then. So it's a real worry. Of course, here we're talking about One Health, so animal health, human health, and the environment. And to debate, I'm going to give the floor to the people on the round table, and I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves. Let's start with our friends who are speaking remotely. Dame Sally Davies, you have the floor. Just 2 words, please. You have 2 minutes to introduce yourself.
Bonjour, merci pour m'inviter.
Hello, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm the Special Envoy from the UK on antimicrobial resistance. I work in a bilateral and multilateral way to help the world to shift mountains, which is what we need to fight this very quiet pandemic. I work with countries throughout the world. The G7, the G20, also UN organizations, groups of world leaders, and I inform them on antimicrobial resistance and the private sector to help them to work on this. Thank you very much for your attention.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much.
Carmen da Silva.
PESSOA da Silva from the WHO. Could you tell us also in just 2 words? The interpreter is sorry, but there seems to be no sound from the video link. So my name is Carmen PESSOA da Silva.
Dans cette organisation vis-à-vis à la coordination du système mondial de surveillance.
I am the unit head and surveillance and evidence laboratory strengthening manager.
Je me rejoins absolument avec les mots que Dame Sally Davies vient de
I second what was said just before regarding the worry on world health, regarding the development that needs to be accomplished. The interpreter apologizes. The sound from the video link is not optimal. There is a very important aspect in order to move forward. All of us have to be aware of the risks. The moderator started the session by talking about the discoverer of penicillin who won a Nobel Prize. And little by little, we gain new levels of awareness from the politicians. Decision makers are aware of the risk more and more. The threat of antibiotic resistance But I think more importantly now, we need other levels of understanding. And this is for the general public as well. They have to be aware of the risks and what they can do to reduce the risks based on the emergence, but also the dissemination of this antibiotic resistance. And for that, we need to know the risks and we need data to achieve this. So these are the very important points that we need to see, knowing the risks and being aware of the risks. Thank you, Carmen, and we will develop this. This is a key topic, you're right. We are going to just carry on going around the table to introduce everybody. Thomas CUENI. I'm Thomas CUENI. I'm the General Director of IFPMA, which is the International Federation of Pharmaceutical Manufacturers and Associations. And I'm also the chairman of the Board of Industrial Managers for Antimicrobial Resistance, which includes BioMérieux, startup biotech, big pharmaceutical companies and generic manufacturers as well, which work together to fight antimicrobial resistance. And I'm the father of the AMR Action Fund. I'm sure we'll talk about this. And Sally DAVIES supported me in convincing the big CEOs to invest $1 billion for research. Well, thank you very much. Jean-Louis Hunault. Hello, I'm the chairman of the Association of the Veterinary Medicine and Diagnostic Industry Union, and I will try and convince you that the animal world is not just a threat. We saw this morning the risk of zoonosis. But what we learned from the pandemic is that the veterinary sector is also part of the solution, and especially when it comes to antibiotic resistance. I'll try to show you how we managed to lower antibiotic resistance in animal health. And this is very important to have this experience that we can share. Thank you. When we prepared, you said you'll see that doctors will be very jealous with my announcements. Alexandre Mérieux, I'm the CEO of BioMérieux. It's a family company working on infectious diseases. So this is a key topic today that we have to be more aware about. I work more on the diagnosis side of things. It's very important for COVID, but it can be useful at other periods as well with silent pandemics such as antibiotic resistance. And what's interesting to me is also to talk about the innovative models that we have to implement to go faster in this particular field. Thank you very much for all this. We'll start the discussion straight away with what you started announcing already. I remember when I talked with Carmen PESSOA that there was this awareness, and I think Jean-Louis Hunault said this as well. She said 2015-2016 was really a key point when the United Nations adopted a 5-point program, a plan, which was signed by nearly 120 countries, I believe, but Carmen can correct me if I'm wrong. And these 5 items are what we're going to talk about in this discussion. And first of all, it's about awareness. The will is to have this awareness and also to explain antibiotic resistance to everybody. Sally DAVIES, you're probably one of the pioneers in this in Europe and beyond. Could you tell us a little bit more about this?
Thank you very much. As you may know, I was co-convener of the UN Interagency Coordination Group on AMR, RAM, back in 2019. We warned that there was no time to wait. We established a set of recommendations for every country and sector to enact to address AMR. But the hard truth is that we have not yet turned our policy and political commitments into action. Our greatest challenge is delivering on the words that people have, and politicians too, and driving ownership for the issue and their solutions. So let me pick up the first challenge, market failure. And thank you, Thomas, for bringing it up. Our greatest challenge is the market failure that's resulted in no new class of antibiotic coming to market this side of the millennium. The unviable market, particularly for small and medium-sized enterprises, is detrimental to access. Many high-income countries have access problems too. For example, of the 18 new molecular entity antibiotics approved by the American, European, Canadian, and Japanese regulatory bodies between 2010 and 2019, the majority of these new antibiotics have not been launched in more than 3 countries. Only 4 have been commercially launched in all European countries studied. To address this, we clearly need governments and industry to work together to balance innovation, access, and stewardship, building on the advances that the world is capable of and has demonstrated it can for the current pandemic. We need to collectively implement pull incentive models that de-link the prices paid for treatment from the volumes used, and that recognize the value that antibiotics have to our health systems. Building on the UK's own Netflix-style model, the G7 health and finance ministers have committed to explore innovative incentive models. We need collective action to create a meaningful incentive and market. My second challenge of 3 is about surveillance. Effective and sustainable action is underpinned by good data. Monitoring enables us to detect and respond, but also predict and prevent, as we have seen during COVID-19. This autumn, a world-first study co-funded by the UK will estimate the burden of AMR worldwide with an evidence base that will help make the silent pandemic visible. We've got to work collaboratively to ensure we have a global surveillance system in place. For example, our UK's Fleming Fund is a major international aid investment dedicated to AMR, with data at its heart, by supporting low and middle-income countries to collect and share quality AMR data. We're supporting countries across Asia and Southeast Asia and Africa to build laboratory capacity, infrastructure, and capability to generate data, share data, and use data to inform national and global decision-making. Our funding for genome sequencing capacity in South Africa has actually also contributed to the identification.
Sally Davies, just a second, sorry to interrupt. Could you have talked about the 3 first items. We are going to come back to this, but I would like to ask for the opinion on this by the other members of the panel, and then we will come back to what you're talking about. This is a world problem, you're quite right. It's not just a European problem or a developed or rich countries problem even, but it would be better that way so we can interact and we can come back to what you said. Around the table here, do you think there's still work to be done on the awareness, on explaining antibioresistance? I was quite struck by what was talked about this morning on One Health by Philippe Vermeer. He said the young doctors and students are not even aware of One Health. Do you think it's the same for AMR? Without a doubt, there is still a lot of work to be done. It starts with the awareness, what is antimicrobial resistance. COVID-19 made us more aware of a pandemic that was unexpected and all countries were ill-prepared. And we realized how much it costs in terms of lives, in terms of financial costs, and we're still in the midst of it. But it also showed the strength of innovation and the strength of acting fast from the industry as a whole, which developed vaccines in record time. And they were developed, thankfully, because COVID-19 was not a tropical disease, but But there was a way. It's not the case for antimicrobial resistance, and as Sally DAVIES indicated, currently there is no viable market, and it's a disaster. It's a disaster for biotechs because the big pharmaceutical companies have left the field, and this is the reason why, by calling on politicians, we launched this fund, and we said we could build bridges for the valley of death, that's what we call it, because the investors have left the market, the big pharmaceutical companies, well, there's 4 or 5, and that's it. And the difficulty is really to translate this world consensus politically to actions at WHO level, at United Nations level, to create a market that is viable, sustainable for the long term. Otherwise, it's going to be a lot of money thrown out of the window. What do you think about this particular plan? Do you think there's work to be done on building this awareness? I think we have to build the awareness in terms of public health, and maybe it's not equivalent from one country to the next. We talked about the lack of border. Viruses have no border, but we need to have this world awareness. We have work to do on this, and I think there are things shifting nevertheless, especially with the AMR Alliance. But I think we have to continue to push for education, innovation in diagnosis, but also with research on new molecules. We have this challenge on human health, on public health, and we need to find a medical value. We'll come to that. And you, as a representative of vets, well, I'm not representing vets or even I represent the industry. It's one sector. It's one sector that is used to managing epidemics in some amount of silence. There were 32,000 avian farms struck by a virus a few years ago, and there was a big vaccination campaign, and last year there were no farms hit, and so we did manage a crisis, and we have great experience from that. And on antibiotic resistance, we've had awareness for a while, and the European Agency for Veterinary Medicine asked me to create an AMR group within the agency to provide our figures, our sales figures for antibiotics. And so we did put in place an instrument for collecting the data, and that meant that the agency, now for 25 years, and with the UK, we were the 2 leading countries to have a state of play when it came to antibiotic consumption. So we have this old awareness, and the mobilization of the sector led to exceptional results. Because in 1999, there were 1,300 tons of antibiotics used for farming in France. In 2019, we got to 422 tons. So we lowered this by 70%. We lowered the amount of antibiotics prescribed in animal health in France. It's considerable. The ALIA, which is the scientific indicator, which is related to this, has been divided by 2 since 2011. Antibiotics of critical importance have pretty much been cancelled, and we have over 90% decrease, and colistin was divided by 2 in 3 years. So these figures show that there is an awareness from the sector, that the vets are aware, that the farmers are aware of this. And so it's remarkable to see that it's possible to get to some results. And the Resapat network that the NSES leads shows this. The 53,000 antibiograms that we get a year show that for all species, there is a decrease in antibiotic resistance. So this is an experience that can be shared, and it shows that mobilization is possible.
On aborde le point clé.
Which brings us to the key
l'importance d'avoir des données.
Central subject, data. How important it is to have data. And maybe this will serve as a transition. You said that the difference to acquire data, the veterinarian environment reacted quite well, but when a vet goes to a farm to take care of an animal, he does not necessarily make a test. He's got the antibiotic in his car and he will inject antibiotics without an antibiogram test. So it's a matter of collecting data and also monitoring.
Les données au niveau diagnostic, c'est clé parce que en fait, faut
data is absolutely essential for diagnostic purposes. We said that this morning we have to keep track of the pathogens, but how do we do that? And how do we optimize the diagnosis? We all remember a few years ago when doctors would give antibiotic for a sore throat, and now we have a quick test, diagnostic test that allows us to decrease the quantity of antibiotics being prescribed. This is going to be applied to veterinary medicine, and I would really like to discuss this for the entire world. How do we develop diagnostic tests, and how do we apply them to low-income countries? Well, in France, I believe that 90% of antibiotics are prescribed by the doctor during the appointment, so there is the doctor's knowledge, but he still needs to find out whether it's a viral or bacterial infection, and we need to find tools for the doctors to use. Technology is evolving. The crisis we've been through has actually sped up the technological evolution for pharma companies, in the field of healthcare. But yes, monitoring, surveillance is essential. Epidemiology should be monitored, and in each country we should set up healthcare infrastructures in a position to prevent diseases and control diseases. So we're talking One Health, but we should also say One World.
For
veterinarians, a company like BioMérieux, are they developing diagnostic tests, quick diagnosis tests for vets? Are we making any progress? Well, we are working more on diagnostic tests for humans, for people, and for the food industry, not so much for the vets. So we still have to do that. But, you know, we said that 90% of infections come from animals, so we need to make progress regarding human and animal tests. What do you think about the data collection networks across the world, not just high-income countries, but also low-income countries? Thank you very much for giving me the floor. Before I go into the heart of the matter, a world surveillance network, I'd like to say a few words, because there are differences in our discussion, but we need to bring this all together. The Global Action Plan, in this plan there are 5 strategic goals, and the point is that the idea would be that it's impossible to solve resistance, antibiotic resistance problems if we only work on one of these strategic goals. And surveillance is only one of the goals in this strategy. And as we said, we talked about a number of other goals, for instance, education, having access to medicinal products when we need them. We talked about diagnosis, and we talked about research and development, and also a reasonable, rational use of these medications. And obviously this means that we need to prevent infections, so that we prevent an excessive use of antibiotics and drugs. But during the debate, we should have a more holistic approach. All of these goals must be addressed so that we can be efficient. They all are linked together. And regarding monitoring or surveillance,
WHO has started a world surveillance system in 2015, and since 2016, we have the antimicrobial resistant surveillance system class. We have included in this system 111 countries from across the world. And we have collected data from 8 million patients to this day. It really matters that we publish a report every year, because some data is rather concerning. For instance, Escherichia coli infections. Escherichia coli in itself is a relatively not very serious bacteria, and yet we already have observed 40% resistance to antibiotics that are being used for serious infections. Third-generation antibiotics, cephalosporins. And this series is now encouraging to use a new generation of antibiotics. And where do we stop? How far do we go? So finding new antibiotics is not necessarily the solution. We first need to prevent infections rather than use new antibiotics. And we need to understand who the high-risk patients are so that we can target those patients. And we also need to improve the methods, the diagnostic methods, and improve access to diagnosis. Even using antibiotics in a more rational way means that we are trained to do that and to prevent infections and to find diagnostic tests so that we can react more quickly. So, on the global level, this is a global issue, and for this reason, when we talk about awareness, surveillance, we also need solidarity, global solidarity. And in terms of surveillance, what we are finding is that low-income countries are making a huge effort to start generating results and data that they can share with the world, with the rest of the world. But we need global solidarity, as was said by Sally DAVIES. They were a key partner to help countries set up a surveillance system to produce data that can be shared with the entire world. I mean, the country itself needs to have data, but it also needs to share it with the rest of the world. And regarding surveillance again, global surveillance, I would like to raise an issue. The low-income countries need global solidarity because they need resources, but there is another issue that is worth mentioning. Do people really want to share data? And that still is a concern. I don't think we have solved the matter, because there are countries to this day that actually have a surveillance system, they have a monitoring system, but they don't share the data. So on the one hand, we have the things we need to do to help set up surveillance systems, but we also have the other issue, what about sharing the data? Not everybody wants to share the data. So then now more than ever, we need global solidarity. Not only for the healthcare system altogether, but also for data protection. Well, it was mentioned this morning. We talked about solidarity this morning, and we also said that in those countries, that in countries where we need a global health system, not just human health, but also veterinarian health, animal health. You represent the healthcare sectors. What do you think about data collection? In France, prescription data are relatively well known. Is that something we see elsewhere? Is that global?
Là, à mon avis, il faut tout simplement constater
I
que les
believe
données chez nous sont supérieures
we
aux
need
données
to
dans pas mal de pays.
accept the fact that data in our countries are in greater quantity and quality than in other countries. WHO has started a big effort for better surveillance and of antibiotic resistance, but I'm not absolutely certain that I can trust the data provided by the states. I have seen myself in my discussions with WHO. There is an institutional issue. Sometimes we hesitate to collaborate with the pharmaceutical companies, with the industry, because they have the data. And that's the reason why I am rather optimistic. I believe that the data that will come out of the National Institutes of Health Metrics in California may improve the discussion. And also regarding solidarity, there's another concern. When the antibiotic is cheaper than the vet's visit and even cheaper than the diagnostic, then we shouldn't be surprised that antibiotics are being used excessively, and especially when antibiotics come from China and India and are less expensive. So it's not a matter of finding new antibiotics, it's also a matter of knowing how to better use the old ones. One of the priorities of our alliance
Mais du point de vue de l'accès, il faut se rendre compte, si on a accès sans assurance de qualité,
whether we mean access without any quality insurance, and we end up with multi-resistant tuberculosis,
avec un programme d'assurance de collecte,
or else whether we really want to implement a program, a high-quality program in collaboration with certified hospitals.
De s'assurer, parce que sinon, on aura très rapidement de nouveaux problèmes de résistance.
That we're going to avoid developing new resistances to these new antibiotics. You're perfectly right. I mean, on the one hand, we have purely economic issues, and they are the reality in everyday life. But it also brings me to the third issue, access to antibiotics and making good use of the antibiotics. So it's having access to antibiotics, but training people on how to use those antibiotics. It might sound easy, but I would really like to ask whether the pharma industry is doing its best to train people on antibiotics, not just in so-called high-income countries, but also in low-income countries. Are people being trained? Are vets really being trained on the use of antibiotics? Our friends who work in the field of diagnosis, can they actually contribute
en donnant les possibilités d'avoir des tests de travailler sur cette formation d'utilisation des tests.
That can be used also for training purposes. Well, allow me to answer. I think we have an awareness crisis here. There are farms and countries where they have changed the way doctors are retributed. Rather than retributing them for selling more drugs, they are now being retributed for training doctors better. 80% of antibiotics are generics. They come from India, they come from China. So Pfizer, GlaxoSmithKline changed the way, have changed their approach because they're in competition with the generics coming from China and India. And the General Secretary of the United Nations has created an institution that plays an essential role. Well, when I asked Sally DAVIES to give us a chance to continue the discussion, saying we would go back to her later, unfortunately she has disappeared, so I'm really sorry. And please apologize on my behalf, because that was a bit clumsy on my part to interrupt her. Earlier you were talking to Alexandre MERIEUX and you asked him a question regarding tests. On our world site diagnostics and animal database, you will find 2,500 tests available. So we have an armamentarium available for veterinarians. They are not weaponless. But we also talked about epidemiologic surveillance networks, and in France we have a network of all the sanitary science associations, all the vets, and every day they update our knowledge on animal health in France. So there is a surveillance system that may be actually adopted by other countries and can serve as a model. Data monitoring is essential.
Il y a deux effets pervers.
And when it's lacking, there are two perverse impacts. We set objectives minus 25%, minus 50%, as was said by the European
Donc c'est une
Commission.
politique à l'aveugle.
And that
Alors
is
que
blind
la politique vertueuse, c'est en
policy,
effet de collecter
because
des
the
données qui
virtuous
permettent
policy would consist in
d'identifier
collecting
concrètement
data
quelles sont
that
les
would be
mauvaises
helpful to
pratiques
identify
de tel ou
bad
tel
practices
praticien. C'est de ça dont on parle.
this or that
Et on a déjà
veterinarian
plusieurs plans
surgeon.
éco-antibio qui ont montré des
And we already
résultats
have
tout à fait probants.
set up
Il est souhaitable que le
antibiotic
prochain qui est en
reduction
préparation
plans, and the next one,
soit
which is
axé
currently being prepared,
sur
should
l'enregistrement
be
des traitements, des
targeting,
prescriptions et des usages.
a better way to keep trace of prescriptions and the use of antibiotics.
Un combat collectif que nous
We
avons.
will hear this afternoon
Et si
the
nous n'avons
president
pas
of
ce
the board of
monitoring, le
veterinarians,
réflexe,
but
c'est de
we
s'en
really
prendre
would
aux molécules.
like to make
On a
sure
eu, il n'y a pas
that
très
we
longtemps,
don't
au
simply
Parlement
revert
européen,
to the
un débat
reflex that consists in
qui a mis en cause les
blaming
molécules
the
antibiotiques,
molecules,
alors même qu'elles
because
sont
there were
enregistrées.
debates where
Ce sont
some
des
molecules were
spécialités qui ont
blamed,
des
although
AMM
they are
et dont
registered, they
l'avenir
have the market
dépend de
authorization,
la bonne pratique
and their
vétérinaire.
future
Donc si
depends
on veut
on
préserver
whether
cet
vets are
arsenal,
going to use them
il faut vraiment
appropriately. If we want to
regarder
preserve
la
that
pratique vétérinaire.
armamentarium, we
Et
should
peut-être un
really
mot sur
look
le prix
closely
des
at how
antibiotiques.
vets are using them, and also look at
Il
the
est évident
price
qu'en
of
santé
antibiotics.
animale, on a
In the
un
field of
modèle
animal
différent de
health,
celui de l'humaine.
we have
Le
an
vétérinaire
entirely
est
different
quelque part,
model.
pour simplifier, à la
A
fois un
vet
médecin,
is both
le médecin
a
des
doctor,
animaux, et un chef
an animal
d'entreprise.
doctor, but also
Il
a company
achète, il
manager,
revend
because he needs to
des
buy
médicaments.
and sell
Et donc
drugs.
il y a un équilibre à trouver,
therefore,
des
he
pratiques
needs to
à
strike a
encadrer,
balance.
nous y sommes tout à fait
And this
favorables,
means also that
pour
we
que
need to provide a
l'indépendance du
framework so
prescripteur,
that
l'indépendance
as a
du médecin
prescriber,
dans sa
as a
dimension
doctor,
médicale
he remains
soit préservée.
independent.
Et donc,
And we need to
pour
preserve
moi, la
that
question du prix de
independence.
l'antibiotique ne se pose
The
pas en ces
price of
termes.
antibiotics is not
C'est le
really
prix
an issue
de l'intervention du
It is
vétérinaire.
more the
Parce que l'antibiotique,
price
on ne l'achète pas.
of
On se le
the
doit prescrire dans
veterinarian's
son élevage
intervention that
ou pour son
matters.
animal de
Because,
compagnie. Et donc,
you know,
je crois qu'il ne
most
faut
of
pas
the time
aborder
you
la
don't
question du
buy
prix de
a vet
l'antibiotique
drug.
sous
You
l'angle
buy it from your vet.
que
You get
pense
it
le
from your vet. It's
consommateur,
included in the
mais quelle est sa
treatment. So we
relation
don't see things
avec le
in
vétérinaire,
the
et c'est
perspective
au
of
vétérinaire de
the
valoriser
pet owner, but rather through
l'ensemble, sa
the
prestation
vet's
intellectuelle, son
perspective. And the
diagnostic, sa
vet
prescription
should
et la délivrance
leverage
des antibiotiques.
this
Je
and
pense que
do his
un
job
débat,
while
autant pour les
delivering
médecins et
antibiotics to the pet
d'avoir
or animal owners.
valoriser une démarche globale, c'est vrai que c'est pas simple. Et
Yes,
tout.
it is
À
not
propos des
easy
antibiotiques, vous disiez
to
tout à l'heure quand on
take this
discutait avant le
holistically.
début,
And regarding
vous avez-
antibiotics,
je vais le dire,
at
parce
the
que je trouvais
beginning
ça
of the
incroyable.
discussion,
Vous disiez, il y a eu une période où
I
certains
found
disaient
it
faut que les
striking. You said
antibiotiques
there was a
deviennent
time when
l'eau de
people
Javel
thought that
des vétérinaires.
antibiotics were
C'est-à-dire
coming,
qu'on
were
quand on arrive,
becoming
allez, hop, de toute
the
manière, on file des antibiotiques, ça marchera toujours.
the disinfectant for
La
the
réponse,
general
ça a
purpose
changé.
disinfectants
La réponse, c'est la
for
prévention. C'est bien
veterinarians.
sûr la
Well, the
vaccination.
On a eu
only
la
way
version
to avoid
prévention.
this is
Et si on
prevention,
n'arrive pas à expliquer
vaccination.
que le
And if we
bénéfice
are
de la
not in a position
vaccination
to
est
explain to
plus
people that
intéressant
the
économiquement pour
benefits
les
of
éleveurs
vaccinations
que d'attendre que le risque
are
se
better
réalise pour traiter avec des
in
antibiotiques, on aura
economic
perdu.
terms than
Il faut
to
donc
wait for
avoir des
the
données,
disease to
nous y
happen and
travaillons,
treat it with
pour pouvoir
antibiotics, then we've lost the
convaincre les
war.
professionnels, sont aussi
We
les chefs
really need to
d'entreprise. Et le
work
problème
and
vient aussi du
convince
fait que ce
those
sont les
professionals
chefs
as
d'entreprise les
company
plus
managers.
pauvres de France.
And they
Si
are
vous
the
regardez
poorest
le
company
revenu net
managers
d'un
in
éleveur,
France.
on est à 600 € net
Farmers.
par mois. Il y a pas beaucoup de chefs
Farmers, in
d'entreprise
average,
qui ont
earn 600
ce
euros a month.
niveau
I mean, there are very
de
few
résultats.
company
Et
managers
c'est donc
with such
là
low
l'enjeu.
incomes.
Comment nous pouvons contribuer à
That's
augmenter
what it really
le
boils
revenu
down
des
to. How
éleveurs
can we
pour
improve breeders'
améliorer la pratique d'élevage? Ça, c'est un point clé. Et je pense que la
income
profession
to
vétérinaire est
improve
aussi engagée sur
husbandry
cette voie.
practices? And I think that veterinarians have a
justement,
role to play.
À propos de
Wow.
profession
Talking
vétérinaire,
about veterinary
un des axes aussi
profession.
importants dans cet
One of the
engagement des Nations Unies,
Main
et ça va faire sourire un peu, mais c'est développer
point of
l'hygiène.
action
Et
under the
on a bien
UN
vu, et
is
ce
to
matin, là
develop
aussi, ça a été abordé
hygiene.
quand le docteur Van der Merch
We heard that from Dr. Van der
a
Merch
souligné, on connaît
earlier.
le nombre de ventes de savon et de dentifrice,
When
et on est loin
we
du
talked
loin
about
du compte
the
qu'on devrait
sale
avoir.
of
Donc c'est un
soap
sujet qui est
and
global.
est-ce que vous avez l'impression
toothpaste.
que
He said we're
l'hygiène
far
dans le
from
monde
the
vétérinaire,
numbers we should be
j'imagine,
selling. Do you get the impression that in the
on
veterinarian
l'a vu avec
world,
toutes les différentes épidémies, c'est quelque
and
chose
we've heard that it has been quite
qui est en
solicited
développement, qui
with
doit se
all the
développer.
epidemics. Do you
Et
think this
de la
is
même
developing
façon,
in
est-ce que vous avez le
this
sentiment que
veterinarian
en
world?
développant, est-ce qu'il y a des actions à faire
And do you
pour
think there are
développer l'hygiène,
actions
pour
that we
développer la
should
sensibilisation sur
develop
ce plan-là? Ça a été aussi
to
abordé
improve
rapidement sur les
hygiene,
fameux
to
gestes
make
barrières où on
people
voit déjà les
aware
gastro qui sont en train de
this
repartir.
has been done for
Qu'est-ce que
the
vous pensez de cette
protective
thématique,
gestures?
qui
We
n'est pas la
can see
thématique clé de
that
notre débat, mais
GI
je trouve que c'était
problems are
intéressant
picking
d'avoir
up now
cette
because
dimension
people
d'hygiène.
are
Souvent le b.a.-ba, le
not
principe, on n'en
respecting
parle pas,
them.
et
Very
finalement,
often
si
hygiene
on
may be
reste
the
bien terre à
basics,
terre,
and if you
et ça
don't
serait
talk
intéressant
about it,
d'avoir le point de vue de Carmen
people tend
aussi,
to forget
au
it.
niveau de
And
l'OMS,
I'd like to
que
have your
faire
position
aujourd'hui
as
pour
well as
développer
comments for WHO. What can we do to develop this issue of hygiene?
La biosécurité dans les élevages
Well,
est quelque chose de parfaitement
biosafety in
maîtrisé, connu.
the
Les organismes font des formations, les
farms
groupements de
is
défense
very well
sanitaire sont
known.
très actifs
There
sur ce
are
domaine-là.
quite a lot of
Et je pense
trainings
qu'encore
on
une fois,
that
cette expérience
topic,
des maladies
and
animales, qui est le
once
quotidien
again, this
des
experience
éleveurs,
of animal diseases,
donne
which
des
is the
résultats tout à
daily
fait,
work of breeders and veterinarians, is a
Vous voulez
good
rajouter quelque chose,
topic for
Eugène,
that.
Carmen?
Carmen, would you like to add anything as to that? Well, thank you very much for talking about hygiene. About that topic, there are 2 points to be taken into account. First of all, hygiene everywhere, not only in the community, but also mainly in the health establishments. So in order to prevent infections, and it's important to highlight best practices, for example, hand hygienes, etc., and to show that this can prevent almost all infections. And there's another topic, which is prevention of dissemination, especially it's important in health establishments, health centers, to highlight the prevention of this dissemination of infections. We all know that health centers, especially at complex levels, can be centers where you have several factors, environmental factors, factors due to the patients, due to the procedures, that are well known as being centers where new forms of antimicrobial resistance might appear. So we've talked a lot about the veterinary sector, but let's not forget the role of the human health establishments in order to avoid the emergence of new forms of AMR. And in my opinion, the programs for controlling infection in hospitals and all health establishments is key to reduce not only the emergence, but also the dissemination of resistant germs. WHO has special programs dedicated to control infection at national level and also at the level of establishments. And we have the support of the countries to promote and develop these programs. When I said, as I said earlier, it's a whole package of interventions that must be carried out if you want to fight the increase in AMR. And hygiene is of uppermost importance. Without it, you can't fight this fight. Thank you very much. Did you want to add anything?
Je regarde aussi traduction, prise de conscience en action politique. Je crois ce qui est bien,
how this awareness has turned into political action. I can see now an interaction between WHO, FAO, OIE and more recently UNEP, United Nations Environmental Programme. It's important because in 2017, the G20 ministers of agriculture were ready to forbid the use of antibiotics for industrial simulation of growth in farms, in cattle breeding. In 2018, there was a coalition between Argentina, Brazil, and the US, and therefore they gave up this idea. And this is not the kind of thing we like to see. And I believe that we should think of this AMR in times of pandemics. We have seen with COVID-19 how much it could cost. In Switzerland, the Minister of Defense was more interested in this topic than the Minister of Health, because he saw it was a problem of security. And I believe we should communicate better and work looking at things in a holistic manner. Good, proper use, access, and environmental waste, for example, in the production of antibiotics. And we should think maybe whether we should try to be more autonomous than we are at present. Jean-Louis, you wanted to react to that? Yes, apart from biosecurity, which you mentioned, let's not forget that our companies now have very global monitoring technologies. There's not only diagnostic tests, but also very early monitoring tools that enable you to identify the animal presenting the sign in order to isolate the animal instead of treating the flock or the herd. More and more with artificial intelligence, companies offer solutions that avoid ending up to having to prescribe antibiotics. So we have to use prevention, new technologies, diagnostic and vaccination.
On aura l'occasion d'en reparler certainement, pas ici parce qu'on n'aura pas le temps.
Well, we'll certainly talk about that again, not now because we have no time, but the basis of prevention is hygiene, and if everyone throughout the world thought in terms of prevention, it would be much better, and in France we still have a lot of work to do. Now the key point is now research and innovation, and when you talk about that, you talk about economic model. In the various discussions, you ended up saying the diagnostic test ends up being more expensive than the antibiotic. Would you say that the progress in research, for example, for tests, you were talking about a test which is rather expensive. What economic model could you think about in order to valorize to have some value return on your research, and for it to be interesting for the countries? Well, says Mr. Mérieux, quite a big question. First of all, let's get back to the continuum of care, prevention, diagnostic, and therapy. First of all, do we cure properly? What can we avoid in terms of bad treatments or in hospital time, for example? And then the objective of innovation. Innovation is always somewhat costly in the beginning, and then with time, with progress, things improve. There is indeed a major economic technological advance in the diagnostic field, and big pharma companies are working on this. It's a top 3 in the public health agenda. Infectious diseases is a highly political and topic, but let's advance, let's innovate, and we'll find the business model as we go. I believe that the health issue is too important to think about business model for the moment. Well,
même si dans le monde vétérinaire, la recherche est différente,
Even
vous allez nous en dire un
if in
mot sur
the
les
veterinarian world
Dans le
the
monde de la
research
santé
is
humaine, il y a
different,
beaucoup
in
de
the
labos qui ont
field of
arrêté.
human health,
Et pourquoi ils ont arrêté?
many
Parce que
labs
c'était pas
have
rentable.
stopped. Why did they
Il y avait
stop?
plus
Because
d'intérêt,
it
donc on
wasn't
appelait un chat un chat.
profitable.
L'industrie pharmaceutique, elle est là.
The
Elle est pas
pharmaceutical
d'abord là, elle est d'abord
industry
pour apporter des médicaments pour
is
soigner la
here
population,
to
mais
bring
aussi
new
là pour gagner
medication
un peu
and
d'argent.
treat
Elle essaye.
the population, but also to make
Si
some
on montre
money.
pas qu'il y a un modèle
If you
qui
can't
peut être
show
intéressant
that
avec une
with the
molécule, oui, qui
model
va être cher.
it can
Parce
be
que c'est normal, elle va être
interesting
réservée. Les
despite
molécules, c'est
the
une nouvelle
high price
molécule
of the
va commencer
molecules.
par être réservée, donc elle va avoir un usage limité.
You
Donc
won't
si elle
get
n'a pas un prix
anywhere. In the beginning, a
attractif
molecule
pour
will have a
l'industriel,
limited
personne va y aller.
use.
Vous aviez
So
des
if
idées,
you haven't got an
vous avez travaillé,
attraction
vous
for
m'avez dit, à
this
l'IFPMA, vous
industry,
avez une
you
idée
won't
de
get
modèle, j'ai trouvé
anywhere.
ça assez,
You talked
assez sympa et
about
assez original.
an
Ça
idea of
pouvait
model
être une approche
had.
sur quel genre de modèle économique on
What kind
pourrait...
of economic model could
La seule
we
solution,
think
c'est
about?
de rendre
Well,
la
I believe
recherche
that
plus
the only
attractive. C'est
solution is to
commence
make
déjà avec les
research more
étudiants
attractive, and this
qui doivent
starts with students
trouver un intérêt
who
de faire
have
des recherches sur la
to find
microbiologie.
renewed
Et
interest in
pour citer un exemple, il y
microbiological
avait une
research.
start-up
And
californienne,
there was a Californian
qui a fait faillite il y a 3 ans.
startup
Ils
company,
étaient avant qu'ils ont
went
reçu
bankrupt 3
l'autorisation
years ago.
sur le marché de la FDA, ils étaient
Before they
valorisés à
got
la
the
bourse avec $1 milliard.
FDA approval, they
Le
were
moment qu'ils ont
valued
reçu
on stock
l'autorisation,
exchange at $1
c'était en
billion.
chute, parce
The
que
moment
tous
they
les
got the
investisseurs qui ont
approval, it
spéculé,
fell
ils ont
because
quitté parce
all
qu'ils ont su qu'ils
investors
n'ont jamais
who
faire de
had
l'argent. Et c'était la
speculated
catastrophe
knew
parce que
they
les
wouldn't
capitalistes
make
riches
money.
ont aussi quitté.
And
À mon
it
avis,
was a disaster
l'industrie
because
va être souple
venture
et
capitalists
pragmatique.
also
Ils
left
ont
them.
vu qu'est-ce qui
So you
seront
have to
des modèles
find
possibles. Quelque chose
a
qu'on a discuté il y
potential
a 4-5
model.
ans, c'était
Something
une
we
prime
discussed 5 years ago
d'innovation
was
lorsqu'on
an
reçoit l'AMM.
innovation premium when
C'était
you
le
get
modèle
your
de Gemonil et
approval.
AB-Drive
It was
financé par la
Gemonil
Commission
and
avait
AB
soutenu.
Drive
Le problème,
model.
c'est pas tellement facile de convaincre le ministre de la
The
Santé
issue
de
is
trouver 1
that
milliard
it's
ou 2 milliards
difficult to
au
convince
début.
your health
Alors,
minister
autre
to
modèle,
find
c'est
1 or 2
ce qu'on
billion
appelle
at
le
the
modèle
beginning.
Netflix.
Then
Parce
there's
que tous
the
les
model
hôpitaux,
called the Netflix model.
ils achètent
Because all
leurs
hospitals
antibiotiques extrêmement bon marché qu'ils
buy
utilisent dans
their
les
antibiotics
opérations
at
pour
a
les
very
genoux,
low
les hanches et
cost
autres. Et ils n'ont très rarement besoin d'un nouvel antibiotique qui
and they
répond
rarely
aux résistances.
need a new
Alors pourquoi est-ce qu'on ne
antibiotic.
peut pas
They
créer un
use
abonnement
it
comme
for
pour Netflix où les hôpitaux
Hepsoni
payent
replacements,
une prime
etc. So why
dans
not
le cas où
find
ils ont
a
besoin,
subscription
ils ont accès à cet antibiotique.
like
La question,
that
c'est
of
comment est-ce qu'on
Netflix,
finance quelque chose
where
comme ça.
they pay a premium
Dans
when
la
they need
plupart des
something?
pays, on a maintenant
In
les
most
DRP,
countries,
diagnostic related rémunération. Alors, par exemple, si on
diagnostic
ajoute 5 €
remunerated
sur les genoux,
systems.
on
So
pourrait quand même financer pas mal si on
even
regarde ce que
though
nous
you
coûte la résistance
use
antimicrobienne.
your
C'est la raison pour laquelle je
antibiotic
suis
for the
extrêmement
knee
content
as
que les
usual,
ministres des
you
Finances
could look at what it
regardent
would
maintenant le problème, parce
cost
qu'eux, ils ont
you to
constaté qu'est-ce
use
que ça coûte
another
Covid-19. Et le
antibiotic.
troisième volet, c'est par exemple ce
And
qu'on
the
appelle,
third
on a vu dans les
possibility
médicaments orphelins,
would be
comment le brevet peut jouer un rôle.
to see
Alors pour
the
l'antibiotique,
potential role
prolonger
of
un brevet
patents.
même à 70 ans, ça n'ajoute pas
if
grand-chose
I
s'il
have,
n'avait pas les volumes, mais créer une incitation
Okay, you can
avec
have
des
a
brevets
patent that lasts 70
transférables
years, but if you do not have the
qui
volume, it's
pourrait
not
inciter les grands
interesting.
labos de
But maybe there should be
réinvestir,
a
et aussi
transfer
incitation
that
pour les
would
startups qui actuellement, vraiment, ils sont désespérés, on a besoin
help
de nous.
major
Ce
labs
modèle,
invest and would be also an incentive for startup
je suis un
companies.
hôpital,
Well,
j'ai de la
maybe
réa,
you could think,
je
okay,
prends un
I'm
abonnement et
a
un
hospital
coût
with a
d'abonnement, mais je n'achète
resuscitation
l'antibiotique que
unit,
quand j'en ai
I take
besoin.
a
Est-ce que ça pourrait
subscription
s'imaginer
and
aussi pour le
I will
diagnostic?
only buy
Et
the
votre
antibiotic when I need
dernier
it.
test,
Could that help
qui
you, for
s'appelle, je vais
example?
retrouver le nom parce que je ne me souviens pas, mais je l'avais
For
noté,
your last
qui était assez
test,
onéreux, vous m'avez
which
dit,
I
qui est assez
noted down,
extraordinaire.
which
Je
is
vais
quite
le-
expensive
je vais
but
vous le donner, parce que-
extraordinary.
Vous le souvenez,
I took note of the name.
c'est,
Le plus important pour moi, c'est le
Well,
besoin
says Mr.
médical.
Mérieux,
Je suis
the
moins
most
expert
important
en pharmaceutique
thing to
que
me
toi.
is the medical need. I'm not such an expert in
Donc pour moi, c'est le besoin
in that.
médical. Il faut être là, il faut être
I'm
proche
more
du
of an
patient,
expert
proche
in
des besoins
the
du médecin. C'est ce qui doit pour
pharmaceutical
moi
department.
driver
But to
l'innovation
me,
et
the
la
requirement of the
Sur le sujet
patient and the
plus pointu là, c'est
physician
plutôt une question pour moi
practitioner
de modèle
is
pour les boîtes pharmaceutiques.
the most
Mais moi, je pense
important
que
thing.
bon
Okay,
y aller, parce qu'il y a une
so it's
responsabilité,
important to have the right model. But I believe
scientifique, mais surtout une responsabilité
we'll get there because there's an issue of public health. So we have to work on models that will further innovation and R&D. And in my opinion, this is a priority. People are working on that, like the Toulouse School of Economics is working on models, innovation models that could be rewarded by the health system. Well, time is flying much faster than I thought. Jean-Luc, you wanted to talk about veterinary research? Well, antibiotics represent 10% of the medication market, so you have to sort of protect the toolbox, let's say, work on so-called green antibiotics, where the selection pressure on the gastric microbiota is restricted and whose pressure on the environment is limited. We're working on it with SIMV, with ANSES, in order to try and have transfers between human and veterinary medicine. And we have a platform called the French Network for Animal Health, which is informal but includes all the stakeholders, administration, breeders, veterinarians, the industry. And we try to map the needs. There's a map that is available on the site so that the industry can direct its and guide its investments in view of the needs expressed by the veterinarians. And this is, in my opinion, one of the paths for the future. Well, we have a few minutes left to conclude this discussion. Let's start maybe with you, Carmen. One word of conclusion. What do you think is key and essential, and what should we be working on? In my opinion, for all these areas of intervention, the key word is global solidarity. Several solutions that have been mentioned can be very interesting and can work for high-level, high-income countries. But when you talk about low-income countries, which represent half the planet, we're still talking about non-access to care or non-adequate access to care. And this is a huge accelerator of resistance because the antibiotics that are used are bad quality antibiotics. The indications are not right. There's no access to diagnosis. So the problems of these countries might expand to the rest of the planet. So, to conclude, I would say we need all that, increased awareness, R&D, new antibiotics, new diagnostic tests, new prevention, but we also need partnerships. And we need to increase the sense of solidarity in all these areas. Thank you, Carmen.
Alors, l'approche One Health, c'est la bonne approche. C'est une approche qui décloisonne.
The One Health approach is the right approach. It gets away with partitions, and that's what we need. We need incentives for research, and usually we're more consumer-oriented. It's better to go towards the more generous part because we need new antibiotics. Jean de said it earlier on. We have a beautiful technological research network. We should play with our assets, and the industry is a real asset for France, especially on this topic. Well, thank you all. I hope that if we're still here in 2050, well, we can dream, why not? We won't get the figures that some are announcing. I'm really sorry about Sally DAVIES. Sorry, I didn't mean for her to leave, and thank you very much, and see you soon.